Hello, dear listeners. Welcome to episode 4 in the Global Far Right miniseries. In this episode, we'll be covering Israel and the Jewish far right more broadly, because it's often quite focused on or relevant to Israel, especially these days. As you'll hear in our conversation, we talk about its presence in the U.S. and some other countries too. But right after I recorded this conversation, though, I heard the news that a relative of an extremist rabbi that we discussed here, Meir Kahane, his cousin, had apparently intentionally driven into anti-genocide protesters in New York City, sending one person to hospital. So it's an important and very relevant topic to the times that we're living in. A topic that we rarely hear covered, though, because there is some understandable hesitance with so many bigots willing to jump on topics relating to any minority group. So I wanted to stress just how important it is to oppose bigotry in all its ugly forms, anti-Semitism being a particularly horrific kind of hate, which we've seen the devastating consequences of throughout history. Just in the past week, as I record this, there have been 2 shootings at Jewish schools in the Toronto area. Thankfully, no one's been hurt, but that is just unbelievably awful and completely unacceptable. We don't yet have any information on the shooters, but our province's premier, Doug Ford, was incredibly quick to blame it on immigrants, again, without any information on who actually did it. We should all be able to understand that hate cannot be fought by spreading more hate. And when actual anti-Semitism is clearly on the rise, it's incredibly important not to water it down by conflating it with things like criticism of Israel and solidarity and sympathy with the suffering of Palestinians. Anyway, we get into that and much more in this chat. If you'd like to help support this teeny tiny show, please consider subscribing via patreon.com/nice mangoes. Patrons get early access to all episodes, and premium patrons get even earlier access. Sign up today for all that good stuff. We don't do ads on this show, so it's entirely listener funded. And if you can, please do leave the podcast a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It really helps others find the show. Oh, and the last episode in this mini-series was on Germany, and I mentioned last time that I would let you know if Germany had been listening, and it certainly has. It's made the top 5 countries that are listening to this podcast several times since. Hopefully, some Israeli leftists will be tuning into this episode too. I'll keep an eye on the stats, and I will let you know next time. And now, the episode. The conditions in the past few years have been a perfect storm for extremism,
is a terrorist attack,
hate,
the transgender community,
and conspiracy theories
pedophiles, the Satanists,
to flourish around the world.
We should unite our forces.
a measure to advance a hardline Hindu agenda.
Great Canadian truckers
Join me as I try to learn more, one country at a time,
Marine Le Pen considerably
in another Polite Conversations mini-series, this time exploring the global far right. Welcome to episode 4 of the Global Far Right mini-series. I'm thrilled to have researcher Ben Gvir here with me. He works with a think tank called Political Research Associates, which researches far right movements, and he's also an author who's had a book come out lately. Hi, Ben. How are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing all right. It's a nice morning over here. Really glad to be on the show.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Firstly, tell us a bit about your book.
Yeah. So my book is called Safety Through Solidarity, A Radical Guide to Fighting Anti-Semitism, and it's co-authored with Shane Burley, who's an anti-fascist journalist based out of Portland. Our book really takes, a progressive and intersectional look at, what is anti-Semitism, how is it related to other forms of oppression that we see in the world, and how is it a threat, not only to Jews, but to all marginalized communities. And, in contrast to the groups like the Anti-Defamation League, which, often fight it through repressing Israel criticism, how can we how can we fight anti-Semitism with solidarity is basically the approach we take.
Yeah, no, that sounds awesome and something that we definitely need more of. So I will put a link to wherever people can get your book in the show notes. And
thank you.
Yeah, I'm just so excited to be speaking with you today. Today we'll be talking about the far right in both Israel and also generally the Jewish far right more broadly. It's something that, doesn't get talked about that often. Like, I will come across content about Hindu nationalism, Christian nationalism, Islamic extremism, and we just don't, I feel like we don't really hear about the Jewish far right so much, probably because it makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's probably a lot going on there, but I think, Jews are a much, smaller group. Just like, numerically, there's, less than 20 million Jews in the world. So it's just a smaller community than the Christian nationalist movement. I think, in the West, there's in the post-Holocaust era, very understandably, it can make people uncomfortable to talk about the presence of a far-right movement in parts of the Jewish community abroad and certainly also in the state of Israel. But I think, with Israel's genocidal assault on Gaza, it's important to talk about both, for Jewish folks like me who want to get our cousins, so to speak, to combat the forces of the far right that we see in our own communities, and for everyone to build more just societies. So yeah,
absolutely. I think it's definitely important to talk about all kinds of extremism, and as you said, what we're seeing happen in Gaza right now, it's really important to try and understand some of the movements surrounding it, some of the views that we hear coming from Israeli officials and IDF soldiers, and because on the surface, it seems so absurd, some of the things you see. And I saw that you wrote this excellent article about the, I think what you called them, Bronze Age Zionists.
Yeah.
That are cropping up, like, after October 7th. I'll also link that in the show notes. But you share, like, these memes and things that overlap with, like, the old school alt-right, Pepe and Groyper kind of stuff, but with, like, Israel flags and Star of David imagery and, like, this ultra-fashy, like, muscular looking guy. And if you could just speak a little bit more about that.
Sure. I mean, I think we have to go, on a little history tour, back to really the origins of the Zionist movement, which, the Zionist movement is, commonly understood as the movement to create a Jewish nation state in historic Palestine. At first, it was a Christian movement in Europe, a long story there. But, in the late 1800s, when early Zionist leaders like Theodor Herzl, or later Zev Jabotinsky, or Nordau, when they started the Zionist movement, they were very much influenced by European nationalisms that were around at the time in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And some of those nationalisms were more liberal, but some very much weren't. And, many early Zionist leaders, Jews have been suffering under centuries of anti-Semitism in Europe especially, and the answer, according to them, was to leave Europe and to build a Jewish nation state, but they also fashioned themselves in the mold of the European oppressors in a lot of ways. They thought, we want to create a Jewish state that can also be colonialist. We want to be, muscular, kind of conquering nationalists, just like some of the European nationalist movements. So that stuff has always been in the mix for Zionism, and over the decades, we've seen it. To some extent, it's kind of like deeply laid in the script of the Zionist movement, but also movements like Meir Kahane were Jewish fascism in the 1970s and 80s, and today, as the Israeli far right is growing and growing. Sorry,
can you just explain for the audience who Kahane is, just briefly?
Yeah, definitely. So Meir Kahane was He was an American Jewish leader who, in the late 1960s, he founded an organization called the Jewish Defense League, and in some ways, it was modeled after groups like the Black Panthers in the U.S., which wanted militant self-determination and community defense for Black folks. But the JDL took it in a very far-right direction for Jews. As the left in the U.S., especially after 1967, became very pro-Palestine, the JDL would they were basically like a street vigilante group that would sometimes, go after leftists on the streets, go after Jewish leftists. And eventually, Meir Kahane moved to Israel and formed the Koch Party in Israel, which was so right-wing, it was banned from the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli, Congress, essentially, in the 80s. Basically calling for the expulsion of Palestinians across the land.
And isn't Ben Gvir a follower of his?
Yes, yeah. Today's Israeli far right, people like Itamar Ben Gvir, who had either a Kahane poster on his wall, or maybe it was a poster of a Baruch Goldstein, another.
Yeah, I believe it was. It was a poster of Baruch Goldstein, the terrorist that killed 20-something people in the West Bank in a mosque.
Yeah, so these movements, these radical right movements in Israel, which today are basically in the halls of power, they trace their origins, back to folks like Kahane, as well as even earlier than that.
Yeah, and we saw some of these JDL flags show up at the campus protest, didn't we? In the U.S.? Yeah,
we did. And we've also seen this awful but very symbolic alliance of Christian nationalists and even a couple genuine neo-Nazis, as well as some Jewish far-right folks who've been sometimes physically attacking or harassing student encampments in the U.S. It's very symbolic of the broader constellation on the world stage that we're seeing right now.
Yeah, it's so bizarre and absurd to wrap your head around that there would be any groups of Jewish people that would be willing to ally with white nationalists and non-Jewish far-right types, and but you see it time and time again. And even if I think back, I mostly cover the new atheist scene and the intellectual dark web on this podcast, but even just the figures from that, we have Dave Rubin, who in the early days, 2015, 2016, was palling around with Stefan Molyneux, Lauren Southern he had on his show, where he was nodding along to Lauren Southern saying, Richard Spencer isn't a white supremacist. He's just a white nationalist. And I think she even said, just the most unhinged anti-Semitic things, in Canada it was the Jews that funded the Nazis so that they could manufacture hate crimes or some nonsense that. But Dave Rubin just sat silently and nodded along with it and helped promote her, essentially. And he's so willing to call Ilhan Omar anti-Semitic, and it's just that contrast is so bizarre. Then we have Ben Shapiro, who's been on white nationalist podcasts, and Christina Hoff Sommers, who accidentally also went on Red Ice, I believe, but then said she didn't know. But it's it was so open. It's so bizarre that you wouldn't know. Yeah. If you had just looked at the Twitter timeline of the person that you were going to hang out with, then you would know, right?
I know. Yeah.
Then there's Gad Saad, who had a Holocaust denier on his show and called her his Viking queen.
Wow.
There's so many. There's Sam Harris, who has said that the Jews in part brought the Holocaust on themselves, and it's just
lovely guy.
I I mean, I feel so gross just even saying these things. So my apologies,
No.
But there's so many of these examples, and these are people who will use their Jewish identity very quickly, while they claim to be against identity politics, to, defend Israel. So defend Israel or minimize actual far-right anti-Semitism, because the context in which Sam Harris said that the Jews brought the Holocaust on themselves was to say that, look, I'm not tribal, I don't do identity politics, I am of Jewish background, and yet I say things like this, so what's my tribe? How can I be tribal?
I know. I know, it's a mess. There's really like a double standard, and it's kind of like walking through like a hall of mirrors, to really start to look at this stuff. It's just kind of really dizzying. I saw last week, just to add like one more example, last week you had Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, who came out against this bill in Congress called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which is a bad bill. It basically, like so many other congressional initiatives, it basically tries to suppress speech critical of Israel by saying it's anti-Semitic. So Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene opposed it. So that's good in a way. But the way they opposed it was by saying, "Oh, there's a line in this bill that says it's anti-Semitic to say the Jews killed Jesus, and that's actually a cornerstone of our Christian faith." So the idea that the Jews killed Jesus is kind of the oldest anti-Semitic trope in the book. It's been used to justify centuries of horrors against Jews in Christian Europe. But who came out and defended them? Ben Shapiro defended them on his show by saying, well, actually, it's a legitimate part of Christian faith to say the Jews killed Jesus. So it's just ridiculous. People on the right look to him as a kind of like totem of Jewish authenticity because he's Orthodox, he wears a kippah, among other reasons, but it's just absurd that, like you're saying, they can, so many folks, not only Jews, but also Christian Zionists, and basically all Zionists can basically demonize identity politics on the left or for other minority groups, but then turn around and basically use identity politics to suppress speech they don't like about Israel. So it's just a mess. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's not even just Zionist identity politics. Like Dave Rubin did the whole thing I'm a gay married man, so how can I be spreading homophobic stuff, but right-wingers will happily use identity politics when it suits them.
Yeah, and they often I see this as very much kind of aligned with folks from other minority groups who join the right, like Candace Owens, or basically folks who will kind of set themselves up as a token, like I'm one of the good ones, right?
Yes.
Candace Owens can use her Black identity to lead the charge against Black Lives Matter, and then so many other white conservatives will lift her up and say, see, she's saying it. So it's really a similar thing here.
Yep. And I'm of Muslim background, but I am a non-believer, so technically ex-Muslim, but definitely don't want to associate with the movement of ex-Muslims that is out there, because that is some awful extreme stuff that is equating Muslims with Nazis and using their background as Muslim to gain legitimacy for saying the most unhinged, bigoted things, the hate crimes they brought them upon themselves because of the actions of Muslims and things like that. So I understand that dynamic well.
Yeah. And then those folks are, allied really closely with neoconservatives, like Jewish and Christian, who, it's all part of the whole Islamophobic, war on terror, crash of civilization stuff. Yeah, it's all these folks are all hanging out together, and we get to trace the connections.
Yeah. But then you see, there was this woman on CNN recently who was talking about groups like JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, which I believe you also used to work for, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm still a member here in Chicago, yeah.
Okay, awesome. But yeah, so she was talking about groups like that as being like tokens comparable to Blacks for Trump or something, and it was just so infuriating to hear that for me, even though, you know, I'm not the group that's being attacked, but it feels very personal because, you know, I am ex-Muslim and, you know, close to this kind of group that is tokenized, so could have easily gone in that direction. And I briefly had a moment with new atheism, so, you know, I'm glad to be out of it, but I feel that personally. So to compare groups like JVP, which are opposed to hatred and calling for peace and wanting solidarity, to like Blacks for Trump or Muslims for Trump, it boggles the mind, especially because when this woman, I don't know if you know the person I'm talking about, she was in that march for Israel as a speaker where John Hagee was invited to speak, and he's like this Christian pastor who's extremely openly anti-Semitic and has said stuff like, what has he said? Something about Hitler?
Yeah, basically he said that like Hitler's persecution of Jews was part of God's plan to ultimately send the Jews back to Israel.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. And that's basically like a fundamental Christian Zionist belief. Like you heard the same thing from the guy, Sean Feucht, who organized like a Christian nationalist rally outside of Columbia. Like he straight up, you know, said on his podcast the night before that rally, he said that rising anti-Semitism was a sign of the end times, and he had this grin on his face. So it's like, you know, it's a deeply laid belief in a way for Christian Zionists. Like anti-Semitism is a good thing because it's you know, helps to, in their eyes, like bring the end times, and so they feign all this sympathy and this opposition to anti-Semitism, but really they like that it's happening. It's really sick the more you look into it.
Wow. Please subscribe to the premium tier or above over at patreon.com/Nice Mangoes to access full episodes of this miniseries. And do get in touch if you think you or someone you know would be a good guest for this series. nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. No E in mangoes. There are still a lot of countries I'm looking to cover.